Kamusta, and welcome to Delving into Asian Psyches, the podcast in which we investigate the pasts, presents, and futures of psychology in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Robin Weber, and today I'm joined by Lorenz Cervantes from the Philippines. So let me start by telling you about the researcher featured in this episode. Carl is a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines and graduated from Ateneo de Manila University, where he researched indigenous psychology approaches. He has written several studies in transpersonal, Filipino, and parapsychology, and just recently written a book about Filipino culture called Deep Roots. He is also very active online, running a podcast, blog, and library under the name Psychodiva, which is a portmanteau of psychology and spirit. In this episode, we will talk about his country, the Philippines, which is located in Southeast Asia. The island nation is part of the largest archipelago in the world and is home to 113 million people with a diaspora of 10 million on top. Tagalog and English are the official languages, but there are close to 200 being spoken in total. The country is predominantly Christian with a Muslim minority and has a history of colonialization under Spain and later the US. Now, let's get into the conversation, and Carl, I'm very happy that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Right. So, to start things off, I think we can get into the past for the start and see how psychology really emerged in the Philippines. If I got it correctly, it started somewhat under the US occupation. And why don't you tell us a bit more about that?
Okay. So psychology, the word psicología, actually comes all the way from the Spanish occupation, from the Spanish colonization era. But it was during the American occupation of the Philippines that academic psychology really came in. And so during that time also people were really into psychology tests, for example, and people were starting to study human behavior, human culture. So it was also the beginnings of social science, especially here in the Philippines. It started really in the universities. So when the Americans brought their psychology into the Philippines, it started with the academies, the universities, where it was being taught by English speakers. And so when you speak in English, when you educate someone, the values of this language, the values of the culture that holds this language, also brings with them the ideologies, the ideas, the concepts that come from that culture through the language. So when the Filipino scholars, who were most of them trained abroad, came back to the Philippines and started really going out into the barrios, the little villages, the rural areas, and started communicating with the communities there, they realized that a lot of the things that have been taught in the universities, or a lot of the ways that the Americans or largely the foreigners tried to understand Philippine culture, was not exactly aligned with how it really was, especially in these communities. And so the movement started somewhere in the 70s called Psikologiyang Pilipino, which means Philippine psychology. But Psikologiyang Pilipino is not one movement. It has multiple approaches. We approach culture through language, through values, through art, through medicine, especially folk medicine. And so all these approaches look into the indigenous ways through which people in this archipelago express themselves and express their psyche. And today, it's just so interesting because today, now that we're becoming more globalized and more connected internationally, a lot of these things, a lot of these concepts are getting somewhat mixed up also within the more, shall we say, universal ideas of psychology that is generally accepted across cultures. But it's a very important narrative to consider where we are now, seeing where we came from before. My point is that now we are still doing that same kind of thing, only in a more practical way. But I suppose to summarize everything that I've said, it really is just that there was that question, about whether foreign researchers or foreign scholars understood us in the right way. And so Filipino scholars took it upon themselves to study the Filipino experience through the Filipino, through the everyday life of the Filipino.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And if I saw that right, it also took quite a while also after independence to build this movement with many branches. Perhaps you can also deepen that a little bit. How was the process of establishing a whole new psychology in the Philippines?
Yeah. Now, the thing is that I'm not sure if we're establishing an entirely new psychology. It really is just the psychology that happens to be there already. It's just that it was misunderstood or distorted in some way to suit a colonial idea of how Filipinos are supposed to act based on the values of foreigners. So it really is just the study of how Filipinos really are, really exploring the cultural nuance of people here. So the development really came from people questioning whether we are understood correctly, and the job has always been to really do that understanding, to do that task of going out and asking questions and putting things into the proper context. Which then, that's a very important debate also within the field. It's that can Filipino psychology, can Psikolohiya Pilipino actually be a universal form of psychology? I think the idea that a lot of us are playing with, or at least that we would like to believe, is that since we are all human beings across the world, then it follows that we have similar or basic foundations in our psyche. Supposedly, I mean, that's the assumption that we have most of the time, especially in experimental psychology with the positivist worldview. But here we see that a lot of things that we believe in, a lot of the structures of our minds, are also shaped by the context of the culture, the context of people within a specific culture, within a specific place. And so that's very important. And we're not making a new psychology, we're contributing to the nuance of the understanding of a world psychology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really nicely put. And I also hear some nuance into interconnectedness in what you're saying. And this also brings me to one of, I think, the core concepts in what Filipino psychology says. And one of those things is that it is inherently transpersonal. Maybe you can tell us a bit, but what does that mean, being a transpersonal psychology?
I see. The concept of the transpersonal worldview, because when we talk about transpersonal psychology, it also has its own connotations, especially the way it's used in other places. But when I'm talking about the transpersonal worldview, it's the notion that the individual self is not limited to the body, but expands and extends outwards to the world. This might not be a worldview that all scholars here share. It might not be, same for everyone, but at least from my perspective, I'm coming from the transpersonal worldview. Transpersonal meaning beyond the person. So not just in the spiritual sense, but also in the cultural sense. The highest, the core value of the Filipino personality is what we call kapwa, and kapwa is the belongingness of the self to other people. It's a shared identity. So I would say, for example, you are my kapwa, and my family is my kapwa, my friends are my kapwa. But just beyond those small social circles, I can also consider every Filipino around the world my kapwa, and that I suppose is goes even beyond that when we say kapwa tao, and when we say kapwa tao, it's fellow man. But what's interesting about this word, and going back to what I was saying earlier about how local concepts are misinterpreted, is that if you try to translate the word kapwa, it becomes other people, which really separates the self from another person. When in fact, kapwa is you, me, and all of us. And so that's what we mean when we say transpersonal. We mean that the self is not just limited. The self is not just an island. The self is an island in an archipelago, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that explanation a lot. And so, since I get that you're very much rooted in the present also, why not let's shift a bit to that part now? And you've already hinted a bit that psychology is also in movement, and Psikologia and Filipino is. So, what trends are you seeing at the moment that are going on in research and the dialogue as a whole?
In terms of the current status of Philippine psychology, or at least the study of the psychology of the Filipinos, we're more focused today. If you look at all the research that are coming out and you're following the trends of whatever's going on today, we're focused more on building resilience. As much as I don't like the word resilience, because it has always been used to wash hands. We call it hugas kamay. People who probably have power to help other people, and especially during times of calamity and climate crises, tend to say that, oh, the Filipino is resilient. And so we see these pictures of smiling Filipinos submerged in flood, and that just romanticizes a very painful experience. But that said, it is also a very important aspect of mental health, is that building resilience in terms of dealing with socioeconomic issues, in terms of dealing with the obstacles of life, especially since the Philippines has a lot of issues with poverty, has a lot of issues with mental health. These are very important things, and so that's where I see psychology work today is focusing on. It's focusing more on development work, focusing a lot of advocacy work, for sure, a lot of advocacy work. That's what I always say to people about when they ask about psychology in the Philippines, is that I always say that, oh, this field is advocacy work. It really is about empowering people, uplifting voices, and giving people the right structure and suggesting policies to those in power who could implement these well.
And so I guess that's where you come into play. And I've already lined out your work a little bit in the intro, but maybe you can also talk about what is currently most close to your heart in what you're doing, and what are you occupying yourself with these days?
Mm-hmm. A lot of people are working in various sectors, very important sectors in the country, and a lot of them, I've worked with I've done research on trauma work and given trainings in gender sensitivity also. And so that part, that work is also very important, given the state of discrimination, a lot of gender-based violence in the Philippines. I've also participated in doing interviews and assessments of drug rehabilitation programs. And so another thing very important, because of the war on drugs also in the country. So all these things, all these things are very important as well. But for me personally, another aspect that is I suppose in danger of being forgotten is our need to look at indigenous experiences in terms of worldviews and ways of seeing the world. During that time, when Psikolohiya and Filipino and a lot of the other fields of social science were blooming, and really started to spread its wings uh, in this in the field of Philippine studies. During that time, there was a lot of documentation on folklore, on folk practices, on mysterious experiences, spiritual experiences. Um, I suppose what my work does is continuing that very important work as well, and so it touches on identity, decolonization, and a lot of these things that perhaps that are really part of the everyday experience of Filipinos. I mean, it's not uncommon to hear, for example, ghost stories or unexplained phenomena that still kind of evade the proper explanation, evade scientific explanation. And so that part of psychology, that mysterious and magical part of psychology, is what draws me and what really interests me. There are a lot of studies recently on revisiting mysterious phenomena. Studies on folk healers, for example, folk practitioners. There was a very interesting study in a few years ago published about spirit possessions in the Philippines. But see, this was the kind of thing that was really occupying a lot of space in the field of psychology back in the 80s, 90s. All this talk about folklore, spirit possessions, and how we deal with mental health cases specifically in the Philippine context. For example, how do we define mental conditions? Can we actually apply the DSM definitions of mental disorders to the Filipino experiences of what might be considered mental disorders? Is it the same? Is there a different way of seeing things here? So as my work touches on that, on identity, on mental health, on understanding the psyche, that is just continuing the great work of the people before me.
Right. I think a lot of people can relate to that around the world, that nowadays we got also interconnected around the world. And at the same time, on one hand, it is really great to have all these opportunities. On the other hand, it's also a great challenge preserving our local identities and knowing who we are. And I want to follow up on on what drives you into that, and you already took that kind of away. It seems so close to your heart. Why not touch a little more on that? And recently, I've also written on deep ecology, which was a new topic to me, maybe also to some of our listeners. So why don't you give us an idea about that and why it is important also in your context?
Deep ecology is a movement of environmental movement of people going back to their connection with the earth, because we've forgotten how connected we are to nature because of this culture that we believe we are separate from the world. And because we feel like we are separate from the world and we are distinct and we have this limited experience, then we are pushed to compete, to colonize, to consume mindlessly. And we forget that we are part of a larger system that works perfectly if you don't rush, if you just take your time, if you just save resources enough for other people. But what I just find really funny is that this, of course, is a Western concept. The term deep ecology was coined somewhat recently. And I think it's funny that this kind of thing is actually very intuitive to a lot of indigenous communities. And I find it really funny because there's that tendency always to label things that are just natural, ancient wisdom. So I wrote this paper on deep ecology and the Filipino spirit world, and really the connection there between how we see nature and how we see its spiritual significance is an important aspect of our relationship with the world. For example, we have folk beliefs that if we cross a grassy area like a forest, we say tabi tabi po, asking for permission for duendes or these little mischievous figures to let us pass. Because if we step on them, we can't see them, but if we step on them, they will give us a curse. And this kind of reverential fear, as an exorcist said, he talked about how Filipinos tend to have this reverential fear for these beings that they can't see in nature. that we shouldn't be afraid because we are God's children. But then that attitude of reverential fear is exactly the attitude that makes us connected with nature. That reminds us that nature is both beautiful and dangerous. And so this has a lot of implications in terms of how we protect biodiversity. Since the Philippines is very well known for its beaches, its mountains, its fields, its natural reserves, a lot of beautiful places in the Philippines that we'd like to protect, especially when they are sacred land where indigenous groups live. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's already a very good introduction, and I think we can all make us a picture of it. Now, you're also very active online and physically. You have a great outreach in the country. So I was wondering, how are the public perceptions about these conversations that are going on in psychology, but also how do people perceive psychology in general in your environment?
Hmm. I I'd like to think that I exist in between the realms of art and academia. I'd like to think that I'm in between those realms. And a huge part of psychology really is artistic, especially when it comes to understanding the psyche. A lot of it involves symbols, folklore, mythologies, and so on. Stories, really. Our ability to connect with other people through stories and narrative is a very creative act. Um, when I speak with people in the mental health field, my friends who I talk to who are working in psych clinics, who are working as teachers, and so on, they do find it a little strange. And I admit that my work, it can be unconventional and somewhat bizarre to a lot of people. Yet, strangely, also, it touches on some very real topics that are just really part of our culture that people don't really think of as much. People really don't think that it's actually weird, but if you tell someone who isn't part of the culture about stories of a third eye, of seeing a white lady on a lonely street, tell other people about this and they will think those are fairy tales or stories or just ghost stories, things that aren't exactly true. But to us, it's real. To us, the experience is visceral. And that speaks to a real psychological source. What is that? And that one I find really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you also go into the practice and application of psychology work just now. And I was also wondering, how does it actually look in practice? I mean, from what it sounds, it's still something that is very ingrained in a lot of beliefs in Filipino people. So how do you work with that? Is there also ways to incorporate these folk beliefs and traditions in the person-to-person work?
Of course, yeah. Uh, Before medicine, modern medicine, came into the country, a huge part of the way that we treated illnesses were through folk practitioners, traditional practice, and the interpretation of what an illness was, especially when it comes to mental illnesses, was very different. It's very, very different interpretations. I suppose what it looks like in practice is that, of course, I'm not going to overstep and talk about the medical field because that, of course, has its own very important work. What I'd like to talk about is the mental health field and how we understand illnesses. And in the Philippines, a lot of it, even the psychologists who or the therapists who practice today recognize that the Filipino experience is very much connected to the body. And also, so illnesses can manifest as physical symptoms, like, for example, people going into trance and then translating that or interpreting that as a spirit possession. But it's important to consider, for example, the idea that in the West, largely, that mental illness is really just the inability to function properly in a capitalist society. So if you're unable to produce, if you're unable to consume, then you're labeled as mentally ill. And so the medicalization of that, these all these labels that today we see on social media of really just ordinary human experiences makes us more distant from each other. But if you look at mental conditions as it is understood here, there's always the question, the folk diagnosis would always go like this. It would be, who did you offend? What spirit? What person did you offend? What kind of magic is attacking you? So it's always our connection with other people and our connection with nature. Did we offend a nature spirit, or did we offend another person because they might have sent some kind of bad, kind of magic done with harmful intentions? And these have terms, of course, in our folk language also. But see, there we see the idea that these conditions must be placed in a proper context, must be placed in the context of community and environment. And so you need understanding that, and applying that in practice, using folk practices within the therapeutic space may allow us to touch onto those cultural values.
Indeed. That resonates a lot with me, and I can tell it's also not just the Philippines that is taking such an approach, but I hear that from a lot of countries in which spirituality is perceived differently than in the West, which has set out the rules pretty much for a lot of the time in psychology. So before we end the discussion, I would also have an outlook on the future a little bit. And what do you have in mind to push your work forward? Is there something you are approaching or planning?
The job of a researcher, of which I am a teacher, I'm a researcher, but the job of the researcher is really to uncover and document a lot of these cultural things. And so I see that as a very important part of safeguarding cultural wisdom. And the task of balancing between, protecting sacred wisdom and sharing this wisdom is a very, very delicate thing. Navigating that route through more research, through more documentation, by finding more resources that can be explained to a modern audience, not necessarily modernizing in the sense that we apply old things and make it new, but that we bring buried things and unearth them and bring them to light, things that we've always known, as fundamental truths to the human experience. So the work continues in terms of research, in terms of discussions like this, in terms of people sharing this wisdom beyond what I share. And so I like hearing when people find my work and share it with others. Then it's not just my work that is shared, but also they find some connection to cultural wisdom that they've always known, they've just forgotten. And what else is in store in the future? I suppose, the work continues in this space. And wherever it goes and however it lands to other people, I just hope that I'm able to give people a space to explore and find themselves where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think getting in touch with new voices and ideas is always the best thing you can do in order to prevail and move on to new fields. And maybe also in a more general view, where do you see psychology going as a whole? Maybe on a Filipino perspective, but also on a broader global perspective. These kinds of views and other kinds of approaches to it, can they find their way into mainstream psychology?
I'm seeing that a lot of, because I don't just limit myself to psychology as a part of the social sciences. I look at, in general, the social sciences. And I'm seeing a lot of work being done that questions a lot of wildly held beliefs by local scholars. So now you see, it started with the Americans coming in and trying to interpret our experiences for us. Now the local scholars questioned that and said, "No, we're gonna define ourselves." And so they questioned the American concept of us and started to explain our own concepts to other people. Now I think we've gone to the point that we question them. We question the local scholars. Are we being inclusive? Are we representing the right voices? Are we actually giving enough nuance? And so there's already that concept of, for example, stuff that I've been reading lately that have been published recently, just in the past year, just in the past year, was that, for example, there's this concept of the subtle creation of a dichotomy between urban and rural that has always been within the field of psychology, for example, especially Philippine psychology, that there are studies done in urban settings and there are studies done in rural settings. And that has never been questioned until now that we're asking, so what does that imply when you say they're from rural settings? What does that imply when you say they're from urban settings? And so urban usually implies educated, elite, traditional, Christian, a lot of lowland applications. But then when you talk about rural, then there's a different implication altogether. So a lot of these things that have been widely held as accurate and connected to the Philippine culture are being questioned. Concepts such as the singularity of what a Filipino is, instead of considering the multitude of ethnic experiences across the archipelago. And now we're focused more on the individual within a context instead of the whole thing within the individual. And I think what I find exciting is that in the future, we're going to start looking at more perspectives and finding more nuance within a post-colonial era. After all that history, finding ourselves moving forward with the knowledge that the scholars before us have given us to think about. And now it's just really enriching ourselves, revisiting, reviewing, reimagining what the Filipino might be. And that's just exciting.
Right. It definitely is. Thank you so much for all the insight you have provided here with me. We have already reached the end of this episode. So thankful for having you on. And if anybody listening got excited about what you're doing and wants to know more about it, how can they best find you?
Right. You can find me online through Psychodiwa. Psychodiwa is Sikodiwa. Psychodiwa. It really is just Psicologia at Diwa, which is psychology and psyche. So just find that name, or find me, find my name. My work is published in different places, websites, in journal articles. So if you can also look at those and just read the stuff that are out there. I also like collecting resources. So if you're able to find my collection of resources, you'll be able to see publicly available linked academic literature on that, and you can start your journey as well.
That sounds great. So thank you, Carl, for being on and sharing all your insights with us. And thanks to everyone for listening all the way through. If you want to know more about the Filipino psychology, I'll make sure to link to Carl's resources. And if you want to hear from other perspectives around Asia, make sure to check out the first episode if you haven't already, and wait patiently for the next one coming up in 2 weeks, in which I'll talk about partner violence in Sri Lanka with another expert. Until then, I wish you have a wonderful time, and bye bye.